At 11:30 hours on the morning of December 22, 1944, Private First Class Leo Palmer, crouched in his frozen foxhole south of Bastogne, Belgium, watching 4 German soldiers approach through the snow carrying white flags. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius. His hands were so numb he could barely grip his Browning automatic rifle. Ice crystals formed in his nostrils with each breath. He had occupied this position for 48 hours, without hot food, without adequate winter clothing, without hope of reinforcement. The German officers walking toward him wore long wool overcoats and shiny black boots. They appeared warm, well-fed, and confident. Palmer understood what they wanted. They wanted the Americans to surrender. The senior German officer was Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of Panzerlehr's Operations Section, carried a briefcase under his arm. Inside that briefcase was an ultimatum promising total annihilation if the Americans refused to surrender within 2 hours. The Germans had every reason to expect success. They had the 101st Airborne Division completely surrounded. 5 German divisions faced 1 American division. The Americans were outnumbered 5-1. They possessed no tanks worth mentioning. They were running critically low on ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft for 6 days. No air support, no supply drops, no hope of immediate relief. What the Germans did not know was that the American commander in Bastogne was a 46-year-old artillery officer named Anthony McAuliffe, who had never considered the concept of surrender. In the next 17 minutes, McAuliffe would deliver a one-word reply that would echo through military history, inspire a surrounded division to continue fighting, confuse and demoralize the German command, and help turn the tide of Hitler's last desperate offensive in Western Europe, the Battle of the Bulge. The German Offensive, December 16, 1944. The Bulge had erupted 6 days earlier, on December 16, when 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest. This was Hitler's final gamble, a massive surprise offensive designed to split the Allied armies, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, pulling veteran divisions from the Eastern Front and collecting every operational tank and assault gun he could locate. Boys of 16 and men of 50 were pressed into service. This represented Germany's final chance to avoid total defeat. The German buildup had been masterfully executed. Units moved only at night under strict radio silence. Horses pulled artillery to avoid engine noise. The Wehrmacht concentrated 3 armies in the Ardennes opposite the weakest sector of the American line. They achieved what military professionals term operational surprise. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had failed to detect the German concentration. Ultra-intercepts had dried up because the Germans maintained radio silence. Aerial reconnaissance was hampered by adverse weather conditions. Ground patrols reported increased activity but were dismissed as nervous imagination. The frontline units in the Ardennes were either inexperienced divisions receiving their first taste of combat or exhausted divisions sent there to rest. The 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for only 5 days. The 28th Infantry Division was recuperating from the Hurtgen Forest bloodbath. They were not prepared for what struck them. The strategic importance of Bastogne. The German plan required speed. They had to capture key road junctions before the Allies could react, before the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to dominate the battlefield. Bastogne was one of those critical road junctions. 7 major roads converged on this small Belgian market town. Control Bastogne and you controlled movement through the southern Ardennes. Without Bastogne, the German offensive would bog down. With Bastogne, they could drive to Antwerp. General Dwight Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. He ordered the 101st Airborne Division to move from their rest area at Mormelin-le-Grand near Reims, France, to Bastogne. The division had been recovering from 3 months of combat in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They had sustained heavy casualties. Many of the men were on leave in Paris. The division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington, attending a staff conference. The assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. That left Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, in temporary command. Anthony McAuliffe was not supposed to be commanding an airborne division in the biggest battle of the Western Front. He was an artilleryman, a 1918 West Point graduate who had spent most of his career around howitzers and fire direction centers. Born in Washington, D.C. on July 2, 1998, McAuliffe attended West Virginia University before entering West Point in 1917. His class underwent an accelerated program due to World War I, graduating in November 1918 just as that war ended. For 25 years, McAuliffe had served in various artillery positions, a competent but unremarkable officer slowly climbing the ranks. World War II changed everything. He had jumped into Normandy with the 101st on D-Day. He had broken his back during a practice jump in May, but still went into combat on June 6. When Brigadier General Don Pratt was killed during the glider landings, McAuliffe was promoted to assistant division commander. He had proven himself under fire in Normandy and again in Holland during Operation Market Garden. Now, through circumstances beyond anyone's control, the defense of Bastogne and perhaps the outcome of the entire German offensive rested on his shoulders. The journey to Bastogne. The 101st started arriving in Bastogne late on December 18th after a brutal 107-mile truck ride through freezing rain and snow. The journey itself was a nightmare. Men packed in open trucks with no room to sit, standing for hours in the freezing darkness. Some trucks broke down and had to be abandoned. Others skidded off icy roads. Men jumped from moving vehicles to relieve themselves, then ran to catch up. They passed retreating American units heading the opposite direction. Defeated troops warning them to turn back, claiming the Germans had tigers, panthers, entire divisions. The paratroopers ignored them and pressed forward. They arrived without proper winter clothing. The division had been resting, refitting, expecting to spend Christmas in camp. Many lacked overcoats, winter boots, or gloves. They wore summer uniforms with field jackets, jump boots that would freeze solid, thin gloves that offered no protection against frostbite. Some wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. Others stuffed newspapers inside their jackets for insulation. They had been told this would be a short deployment, a few days at most. They would stop the Germans, hand over to relieving units, and return to camp. No one expected to be surrounded. No one expected to be under siege. No one expected what was about to happen. By December 20th, German forces had severed all roads leading into Bastogne. The 101st, along with elements of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various other units that had retreated into the town were completely encircled. Approximately 14,000 American troops were trapped in a town that before the war had 8,000 inhabitants. Outside the perimeter, 5 German divisions pressed inward. The 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and elements of 2 other divisions. The Germans possessed tanks, artillery, ammunition, supplies, and time. The Americans had determination. The first major loss that shook the defenders occurred on December 19th, when Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade was killed by German artillery at Noville. Laprade commanded the 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He had established his headquarters in a building in Neuville, a small village north of Bastogne. A German 88mm shell crashed through the building. Leprade was killed instantly by the explosion. Major William Dosabry, who was with him, was severely wounded, losing an eye. The sudden death of a battalion commander sent shockwaves through the regiment. If a lieutenant colonel could die that quickly, that easily, what chance did privates and corporals have? The second devastating blow came when most of the division medical company was captured. The medics had established an aid station in what they believed was a secure area. They were treating wounded from the previous day's fighting when German forces suddenly appeared. The Germans had infiltrated through a gap in the American perimeter during the night. Within minutes, the aid station was overrun. Over 100 medical personnel were captured, including crucial surgical staff. Dozens of wounded Americans were taken prisoner. Medical supplies, ambulances, surgical equipment, all lost. From that point forward, the wounded in Bastogne would receive only the most basic medical care. Conditions inside the perimeter. The losses mounted daily. Each death, each capture, each wounded soldier who could not be properly treated added to the desperation. Company commanders who started with 150 men were reduced to 60 or 70. Platoons that should have numbered 40 men had 15 or 20. Squad leaders commanded 3 or 4 soldiers instead of 12. The defenders understood they were on their own. No relief was arriving soon. The weather prevented any air support or supply drops. German artillery pounded the town day and night. The Niebler-Werfer rockets came in salvos of 6, their distinctive howl terrifying soldiers and civilians alike. 88mm shells punched through buildings like they were constructed of paper. 150mm howitzers turned entire blocks into rubble. The medieval buildings offered little protection. Stone walls that had stood for centuries were blown apart by high-explosive shells. The Cathedral of St. Peter sustained multiple direct hits, but somehow remained standing. The town square became a moonscape of craters and debris. Civilians huddled in cellars as their homes collapsed above them. Some cellars held 50 or 60 people, men, women, children, babies, all pressed together in the darkness, listening to the thunder above, wondering if the next shell would bury them alive. The cold proved as much an enemy as the Germans. Temperatures dropped to -28°C on the worst nights. Rifle bolts froze solid. Machine gun mechanisms had to be worked constantly to prevent freezing. Morphine syringes had to be thawed in medics' mouths before injection. Blood plasma froze before it could be administered. Men urinated on their rifles to thaw the actions. They learned to keep one round chambered at all times because working the bolt might prove impossible. Frostbite claimed more casualties than German bullets some days. Men would remove their boots to check their feet and discover toes black with gangrene. The medical aid stations filled with soldiers who would lose fingers, toes, entire limbs to the cold. December 22nd. The ultimatum. By the morning of December 22nd, the situation in Bastogne was critical. The defenders had been under constant attack for 2 days. The temperature had dropped to -20°C at night. Wounded men were dying from exposure as much from their injuries. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the few remaining medics. Men's feet swelled so badly from the cold that they had to cut their boots open to prevent gangrene. The American artillery was running dangerously low on ammunition. Some batteries were reduced to 10 rounds per gun. Infantry units reported they had sufficient small arms ammunition for 1 more serious engagement, maybe 2 if they were careful. Food supplies were critically low. Most units were on 1/3 rations. Hot food was a memory. Men survived on cold K rations and melted snow. Medical supplies were almost exhausted. Morphine was rationed. Surgeons operated without anesthetic. Bandages were washed and reused. The wounded lay on church pews and classroom floors because there were no more stretchers. McAuliffe knew all of this. He visited the frontline units every day, driving through artillery barrages in his Jeep, walking the perimeter, checking positions, speaking with the men. He observed the exhaustion in their faces, the hunger, the cold, the fear. He saw 18-year-old privates with feet so swollen from frostbite that they could barely walk. He saw sergeants who had not slept in 4 days, still directing their men, still fighting. He saw lieutenants of 22 or 23 years commanding companies because all the captains were dead or wounded. He saw all of this and understood they could not hold much longer without relief. That was the situation when the 4 Germans approached Palmer's position at 11:30 hours on December 22nd. The surrender demand. Palmer did not know how to respond. Enemy soldiers approaching under a white flag had not been covered in the training manual. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson, who had been manning a position nearby, took charge. He called the Germans over. Lieutenant Henke, who spoke perfect English, explained they had a written message for the American commander. They would consent to being blindfolded. In fact, they had brought their own blindfolds, white cloth strips that appeared to have been torn from bedsheets. Private First Class Ernest Premitz, a medic who spoke German, joined Dickinson. Together they blindfolded the 2 German officers and led them on a circuitous route through the American positions to F Company's command post. The Germans could not see where they were going, but they could hear. They heard American voices, tired but determined. They heard weapons being cleaned and loaded. They heard sergeants issuing orders. They did not hear panic. They did not hear defeat. The message was passed up the chain of command. First Sergeant Konstantin Kappas informed Captain James Adams that the Germans had delivered a written message. Lieutenant William Hertzky was on the telephone reading it to the battalion command post in Marvy. From battalion it proceeded to 327th Regimental Headquarters. Colonel Joseph Harper, the regimental commander, was out inspecting positions. Major Alvin Jones, the regimental operations officer, took the message and drove to division headquarters. It reached McAuliffe at 11:45 hours. He was in the headquarters basement in the Heinz Barracks, a cold, damp stone room that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Maps covered the walls, marked with red and blue symbols showing enemy and friendly positions. Radio operators hunched over their sets, attempting to maintain communication with the scattered units. Staff officers worked at wooden tables lit by kerosene lanterns because the electricity had been severed 2 days earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, entered McAuliffe's sleeping quarters and woke him. The Germans had sent representatives forward to negotiate American surrender, Moore explained. McAuliffe, still groggy from sleep, sat up and responded, "Surrender? Oh, nuts." Moore handed him the German message. It was typed on 2 sheets, one in English, one in German. The diacritical marks on the German copy had been entered by hand, suggesting it had been typed on an English typewriter. The English version read, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the River Orth near Ortheville, have taken Marche and reached St. Hubert by passing through Hompré, Sibret, Tillet. Liebermont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town of Bastogne. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The German commander. McAuliffe read the message, crumpled it into a ball, threw it in a waste paper basket, and muttered again, "Ah, nuts!" Then he walked out to visit some units on the western perimeter to congratulate them for eliminating a German roadblock earlier that morning. As far as he was concerned, the German demand did not merit a response. The Germans were sustaining significant losses, and they wanted the Americans to surrender. It was absurd. Crafting the response. However, the Germans were waiting for an answer. They had arrived under a flag of truce with a formal, written demand. Military protocol required some form of response. When McAuliffe returned to headquarters an hour later, his staff was discussing what to communicate. Someone suggested a formal military response outlining why surrender was not an option. Someone else suggested explaining the tactical situation, that the 4th Armored Division was approaching from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, had a different suggestion. Inside headquarters, in the presence of his staff, McAuliffe wondered aloud, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." At that point, Kinnard said, "Sir, what you said initially would be hard to beat." McAuliffe asked, "What do you mean?" Kinnard responded, "Sir, you said nuts." All members of the staff enthusiastically agreed. McAuliffe grabbed a piece of paper and wrote, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." He handed it to a clerk and instructed, "Have it typed up." Delivering the message. The typed response was given to Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Harper would deliver it personally to the German officers who were still waiting blindfolded in the woods adjacent to F Company's Foxhole command post. Harper took Private First Class Primetz with him as interpreter. When they reached the German officers, Harper handed the message to the blindfolded Major Wagner, placing it in his hand. Hank inquired whether the reply was written or verbal. Harper stated it was written. Hank asked about the contents of the message because, if it was affirmative, they were authorized to negotiate further. Harper stated, "The reply consists of a single word, nuts." Hank, not understanding, asked, "Is that reply negative or affirmative?" Harper replied, "The reply is decidedly not affirmative," adding, "If you continue this foolish attack, your losses will be tremendous." Hank translated for Wagner. The major nodded. The two blindfolded German officers were then driven by a roundabout route back to their entry point at the Kessler farm. There the blindfolds were removed. The Germans opened and examined the reply. They asked, "What does this mean?" They obviously did not understand the American slang. Harper and Primetz discussed how to explain it. Harper suggested, "Tell him to take a flying shit." Primetz considered this, then straightened up, faced the Germans, and said in German, "Du kannst zum Teufel gehen." You can go to hell. The German major's face darkened. Hank translated Harper's additional comment. "If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." Hank replied, "We will kill many Americans. This is war." Harper replied, "We will kill many Germans." Then Harper said, "On your way, bud, and good luck to you." After Hank translated, the major acknowledged. They saluted, and the Germans began walking away. Harper angrily called out, "If you don't know what I'm talking about, simply go back to your commanding officer and tell him to just plain go to hell." As the German major passed Palmer's position, he threw down his blindfold. Palmer caught it. He would later use it to clean his Browning automatic rifle, then discard it, not realizing its historical significance. The German reaction. The German party returned to their lines at 1400 hours. They drove first to the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment headquarters at Remafoss, then to Panzer Lehr Division headquarters about a mile further south. General Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, happened to be at Panzer Lehr headquarters. When Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henk presented the American reply, Leutwitz could not believe it. He had been confident the Americans would surrender. He had already prepared to accept the surrender, to march into Bastogne as a victor. Instead, he received a one-word message he did not understand. General Fritz Bayerlin of Panzer Lehr Division suggested it was time to initiate the artillery barrage as threatened. Leutwitz interrupted him, explaining that the heavy artillery was no longer available. It had been repositioned to forward positions past Bastogne to support the drive toward the Meuse River. The 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions mentioned in the ultimatum were a fabrication. Leutwitz had been bluffing, attempting to intimidate the Americans into surrendering without a fight. When the bluff was called, he possessed nothing. The promised massive artillery barrage never materialized. The psychological impact. Word of McAuliffe's reply spread through the American lines within hours. Soldiers who had been on the edge of despair suddenly discovered new energy. If the general considered the situation nuts, not desperate, then perhaps they could hold out. If the commanding general could tell the Germans to go to hell when surrounded and outnumbered 5-1, then by God, they could continue fighting. The story grew with each retelling. Some claimed McAuliffe had torn up the surrender demand. Others claimed he had used much stronger language than nuts. But everyone understood the message: no surrender, not now, not ever. Vincent Vicari, McAuliffe's personal aide, would later confirm that nuts was exactly what the general said. General Mack was the only general I ever knew who did not use profane language. Nuts was part of his normal vocabulary. When asked years later about the famous reply, Vicari stated it perfectly captured McAuliffe's personality: direct, unpretentious, and absolutely determined.